So I'm John Boswell, and along with Marta, who you've just met, one of the co-conveners of the APSA-related group for critical policy studies. It's really lovely to see on Zoom a few familiar faces and a few new faces too. That's great. So we put together a panel this year. We thought this year of all years, when there's no conferences for people to go to and no kind of incidental discussion about the publishing process and so on, that particularly for ECRs, it would be really useful to put on an event where we discuss the ins and outs of publishing, and particularly trying to publish work in a more interpretive or critical tradition. So we have invited along esteemed editors from some of the biggest and most important journals in the field. So delighted to have Jennifer Dodge, who's Associate Professor at SUNY and co-editor of Critical Policy Studies. Peter Feindt, who is a professor at Humboldt-Universität in Berlin, and has for a long time been the co-editor of the Journal of Environmental Policy and Planning. And Chris Weible from the University of Colorado in Denver, who was for a long time the editor of Political Studies Journal and is about to take up a role as a co-editor of the Policy and Politics Journal. And so we thought we'd get them along and ask them questions and quiz them about the publishing process and their experience and what they know. So with those introductions out of the way, it's kind of an interview format, and I'll be delighted, and we'll follow the chat if you drop in questions or comments that you'd like to make. But I will lead us off with a nice kind of soft question for everyone, for the panel. And that is to say, you were all authors before you became editors. What is it about being an editor that you didn't know about the publishing process? What have you learned? What can you pass on to the other people on the call? So let's start with Jennifer.
Well, first, thank you both so much for organizing this. I really appreciate it. And it's so nice to see so many friends and colleagues out there in the audience. That's an interesting question. I hadn't really thought about it. I think, there are things that go on behind the scenes that you're probably unaware of as an author, where, editors have lots of discussions about what is the scope of the journal? How can we stay relevant and current? So we have ongoing discussions about that, things that we want to highlight in the journal that reflect our particular point of view. So for critical policy studies, that's obviously, we're really interested in critical work and interpretive work. That's very much a part of our foundation. Our founding members were really concerned to have a space for critical scholarship in the policy field. So we have ongoing conversations about what does that mean? What are some of the issues that are going on in the world that we really want to see analyzed from a critical point of view and an interpretive point of view, and how can we make a space for that? And we're also looking for authors who are, doing really strong, high quality work that fits that scope and that profile. And we have lots of discussions, about who are appropriate reviewers to look at that kind of work and to give good feedback for people who are doing critical and interpretive work, to make sure that the feedback that people get is, useful and productive and supportive of people who want to do this type of work. So our reviewers are very good at looking at critical work from a critical perspective and point of view. So I think, understanding the journal that you're submitting to is really important. We get a lot of pieces that are not a good fit. So it's important to pay attention to that. And I think, the audience here is really interested in critical work. So I would say, think about critical policy studies to place that kind of work, where we have reviewers who understand it, who, are part of this broader community. Yeah, I don't know if there are specific questions about things that go on behind the scenes, I'd be happy to talk about that. But it's it's an ongoing negotiation. All of these things are like an ongoing negotiation. Yeah.
That's great. That's a really great opening salvo, and it's anticipated a few of my other things I was hoping to probe for, and I'm sure the audience will be too. But that's great. Chris.
Yeah, sure. First, again, thanks, John and Marta, for the opportunity to be here. I do feel fortunate to be part of this group, and also welcome everybody zooming in. I see some familiar faces, some faces I haven't quite met, but hopefully, hopefully have a good discussion and learn from each other here. You know, in terms of like, at least for me, I've been editing for a while, various journals. And I think one thing I just kind of dawned on me when I started this is just how much this is a black box. And from the outside, you don't quite know what's going on the inside. And there's, you send your manuscript in, and what you don't realize on the outside is that how many decisions happen from do you desktop reject or not, the choice of referees, how you interpret those referees' feedback, do you reject, revise, resubmit, what type of feedback you give. And all those all those little decisions, mistakes can happen, judgments happen, good decisions can happen. And all this can kind of, you know, sink or swim your manuscript. Sometimes, you know, we put our heart and soul into what we do sometimes as kind of both that's, you know, our art and our science. And it's hard to get that feedback from referees sometimes. It's hard to get those decisions. It can be very painful for, I mean, I've felt that as an author. And you know, and I do think journals can ease that pain and also move the field forward and help us develop our skills and our craft and what we do. But it is kind of, there's a lot going on inside there. And, you know, hopefully today we can talk about what happens and at least the choices we make and so forth. And I guess I will say, you know, sometimes, yeah, the review process is really frustrating at times. I do find that sometimes referees, lean towards the status quo, not always open to new ideas. And I do think sometimes it's really good for editors to kind of play roles to keep the, you know, don't play the strict gatekeeper of ideas, let ideas float on, let's say, the market and see what happens. Because there is a tendency to kind of push back on people trying to change things up too much. But I can expand a lot more too, but I will pause right there.
Great, thank you very much. And again, that hits on a few things I think we'd like to probe a bit deeper, but we'll come back to them. Peter.
Yeah, again, thank you very much for Marta and John for setting this up, and thanks everybody for tuning in around the globe. It's really great to see some familiar and some new faces around. Yeah, when I joined the editorial team of the Journal of Environmental Policy and Planning in 2012, I wasn't really quite sure what I was getting into. And because as Jennifer and Chris have already said, there are lots of small and minor decisions that you're making, but altogether they accumulate something like a direction of a journal. So what we found is that it was absolutely important that at least once a year we have something like a retreat where we reflect on the aims of the journal, on what we want to achieve, how the processes are running. What we also experienced during that time was, first of all, that there was a heritage there. And it's quite surprising. We recently wrote a piece about 20 years of the journal and how has it developed. And we found actually that what we are now doing was pretty close to what the original journal founders envisioned around the turn of the century or around the millennium. So it's interesting that obviously we have also inherited something like a community around the journal, people who feel somehow attached to the ideas of the journal. And these people are on the one hand, the broader editorial board, but it's also authors who are returning, authors who come back to the journal and say, oh, we've got an interesting idea here for a special issue, or we would like to recommend you another author, or they point colleagues to the journal. So I found that quite amazing how much of a network was behind the scenes around the journal, in which we could also tap in terms of then doing mundane things like recruiting reviewers. What we've also experienced is, of course, the broader changes in the academic publishing world. So we've experienced enormously increasing numbers of manuscripts that are being submitted, which meant that we really had to change our processes. Because like 10 years ago, apart from a few manuscripts that were really quite poor, we still tended to send a large share of the manuscripts out for review. Since a few years, that's absolutely impossible because we just can't find enough reviewers. So we've become much more strict at the first stage, the desk rejects. And that also meant that we've tried to develop more guidelines and to be very strict with regard to the aims of the journal. Decisions about how much airtime we want to give to different kind of approaches. So at some point, we had a number of quite interesting papers, more from an ecological, economic background. And at some point, we had to decide whether we want to go further into that direction, because then up a lot of pages, or whether we want to stick closer to the original vision of providing critical perspectives on environmental policy and planning. And then we went for the latter, which is also one of the reasons why I would say that a relatively large share of the papers that we have published has some kind of an interpretive or critical background, not all of it. But we also had a number of special issues on discourse analysis, for example, on issues like reflexive governance that I think very much resonate with the community here. And we've also noticed that many authors are finding us who like this perspective and work on kind of environment related issues. So much for now as a starting point. There's, of course, much more to say here about the kind of papers that we are looking for, but it's a kind of constant process reflecting on developments in the broader community. Maybe the final point is what we really enjoyed, and that is something that we should have done much earlier, was that to celebrate 20 years of the journal, we invited the members of our editorial board for a workshop conference in Berlin. And that was absolutely an amazing experience. So anyone who is on an editorial board or who edits a journal, I would really recommend that, because it also helped us to think about the next stage in the journal development. And it was also really amazing to experience the energy that could be created around such a journal as a social endeavor. So once we are able to travel again and meet again in the same room, I think that's some of the things that we should really consider. Yeah, so much maybe as a first statement.
Great, thanks so much for that. Thanks everyone for your first forays there. And we're now imagining all how wonderful it would be to go to Berlin and travel and see things again. So a lot, I think obliquely or directly, you all kind of mentioned it. I guess the first question that you have in your mind as an author is about the fit of the journal. So we're talking here mostly to a kind of interpretive critical crowd. And the question, I guess, I have, and I presume many of the other people on the call have, is, where should you target it? So we've kind of deliberately got some different types of journals here. So essentially, critical policy studies, which is kind of the home ground for this kind of work. The Journal of Environmental Policy and Planning, which, as you say, has a kind of it's a common theme or thread. And then journals like Policy and Politics, and probably even more so Political Studies Journal, where it would tend to be more a minority. Yeah, it still publishes some, but it's not the bulk of what gets published. So the question, I guess, is when do you know you have a paper to go to which sort of journal, and how would you make that decision? What do you think about and from your perspective, the fit? How do you kind of elicit journals that are a good fit? How do you filter them? Papers. So whoever wants to kick off on that would be, I'll leave it open.
Well, I can jump in. I think you want to think about what is the audience that you want to reach. I think if you want to speak to a critical community because you want to engage in some of the conversations that are happening there, then critical policy studies is a really good option. I think if you want to be in conversation with people who are focusing on environmental issues, JEP is a great place. And if you want to engage the mainstream, which I think critical scholars need to do, then you want to look at more mainstream policy journals. I think when you do that, you also have to think about and adjust what you're writing so that it's targeted toward that particular audience, and be prepared for defending a critical perspective if you're going with a mainstream journal. I think anyone here who has submitted critical and interpretive work to a mainstream journal knows that there's quite a bit of effort that goes into that. You often have to engage in some serious conversations with your reviewers and your editor around what it is that you're trying to do and what appropriate standards are. So I'm willing to talk more about that if people are interested in that. And I think you have to do a lot less defending when you submit to critical policy studies, because you can have a higher level conversation there with your reviewers and with the editors, because there's already common ground in terms of what it is that you're trying to do. So those are some considerations that you need to take into account when you're thinking about what's the right fit. It's who do you want to be engaging around the ideas that you're developing. I think if you're putting together some cutting edge critical work, you might want to submit that to critical policy studies, because you're going to get some feedback where people understand that you're trying to advance the conversation in a critical sense. I suppose you could also put that in a mainstream journal too, but then the conversation is slightly different because you're challenging maybe some of the mainstream perspectives and points of view on that and trying to open up the conversation there to embrace critical perspectives. So I think those are some considerations that I would have as an author. And, you know, as a reviewer or someone who manages the review process, I would want to make sure that work like that is going out to appropriate reviewers who understand the particular critical perspective that you're taking. I think it's important to understand that critical work is not monolithic. We have at least 4 different, maybe 5 different sub-communities within critical policy studies that look at these things in different ways, and we would make sure that you get reviewers in the area that's appropriate for you. I think when you submit to a more mainstream journal, then you have to figure out how are you going to be in conversation with a mainstream perspective and point of view, and how do you change your language in order to engage in that conversation in a way that you'll actually be heard and will be received. I'd be curious to hear what other people in the audience have to say about that question too. I think we have a lot of people here who have a lot of experience doing both that could also lend some interesting insights here. So I would welcome people to write in the chat if you have different experiences trying to do that also.
Yeah, for sure. And also raise your hand if you want to have say your piece. Did Chris or Peter, did you have a reflection on that?
Sure, if it's okay. I mean, I will put a plug in to the journal that I'm becoming a part of, the editorial team, Policy and Politics, which I'm sure many of you know. It has a strong tradition of being a top-ranked journal. I'm joining on the editorial team with me is Oscar Berglund and Clara Dunlop. And of course, that journal, if you know, the journal is being kept afloat and steady by Sarah Brown, the journal's manager. And also we have Elizabeth Cobley, who's our digital associate director. She'll be doing our tweets. But I will say, I mean, the vision of the journal is to be a general public policy journal, public policy broadly defined. And we're looking for comprehensive coverage that embraces and endorses, you know, multi epidemiological, ontological, methodological perspectives. And so we are supportive of interpretive and critical approaches, along with other approaches. I don't consider it a mainstream journal supportive of interpretive or critical theories, but I view it as a general journal where interpretive and critical theories are just part of its coverage. And similar to what Jennifer was saying, you know, different approaches require different types of reviewers, and we're very cognizant of that. You will see on the editorial board people who understand, eventually, it's not quite there yet, but people understand critical and interpretive approaches. And so you will see a journal that I think you will get a fair shake. It's not like it's easy to get through any type of review process, but you know, you will find a journal that is cognizant of what interpretive and critical scholars are trying to do, at least, and trying to understand it and support that community. And we could talk more about that later on, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, maybe just to add a few remarks. I think I really agree to what Jennifer and Chris have just said. You might also want to look how publications in certain journals add up to the profile of your CV. I think that's particularly important for mid-career scholars. So because you give a signal for which communities you are writing, of which academic communities you want to be a member. So with JEP, we are a distinctively interdisciplinary journal. We publish lots of work from a political science background, but we also have lots of geographers writing for us and other environment-related social sciences. And that might be an advantage in some contexts, but it might also be a disadvantage in other contexts. Of course, you will certainly also experience different approaches by editorial teams to the editorial process. Some journals that have recently established themselves with relatively high impact numbers, they seem to prioritize a very quick turnaround. also in the way they treat authors. That authors have about 1 week time to respond to major revisions. That is a certain approach that also, I think, betrays a certain idea about the intellectual process involved in writing a paper. Other journals emphasize more the kind of in-depth conversation between reviewers and editors and the authors, where in particular the editors, supported by reviewer opinions, also try to help authors to further develop papers. Someone has said that's something like slow publishing. That's not my term, but these are different approaches, and it depends on your needs. I know many people have certain institutional pressures to publish quick. You need to get certain papers out, but that's a different way, and it's also part of developing your own position within this entire publication game.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. Again, the offer stands if anyone would like to pipe up or say something from the audience. But I think something you all mentioned there and is of interest, I guess, is the question of finding reviewers. And I guess, I mean, from what I understand, it's always a challenge finding reviewers, and particularly at the moment, a challenge. In terms of what to expect as an author, will a reviewer, so for example, if we take two polls here, so at a journal like Policy and Politics, would we expect, say, one reviewer to be a fellow traveller and one reviewer to be a generalist person? Would that be fair? Is that something, or do you tend to try and make everybody? Sure.
I mean, of course, we don't have hard and fast rules on this. If a manuscript were to come out, I can imagine, let's say it's an interpretive manuscript, picking two interpretive reviewers that fit as best that we can find fit, and we maybe even find help in that. And yeah, maybe finding more of a general scholar, mainstream scholar, who's at least not so dogmatic and open to providing constructive feedback. Because, and similar to what Jennifer was saying, I mean, I think if, when I publish in a journal that's all geared towards, let's say, policy theory, I can take a few things as kind of like I can assume that the audience is a certain thing and will understand certain things. But when I publish in more of a general journal, I have to reorientate my research and my messaging for a wider audience. And I think Policy and Politics, yeah, it's going to be a wide audience, and so we want that, but also we don't want. I'm a big fan of preserving the integrity of the research and the manuscript of the author. And so I don't want to turn an interpretive paper into like a mainstream paper based on some mainstream scholar's opinion about what it should be. It has, but at the same time, it has to be able to communicate across different scholarly orientations and make sense.
So that's great. And I guess the other, the kind of related part of that for all of you is, with this sort of work, is the review process any different? So do you tend to have more trouble finding reviewers? Do reviewers tend to be more, we call it in Britain the Marmite, either you love it or you hate it, response from readers? Is there anything different or special about doing this kind of work, or is it much of a muchness? And again, I guess for critical policy studies within the different traditions or sub-traditions, is there any difference, anything we should?
So clearly John is breaking up, and I'm not sure I completely got the question. But I think, let me just respond to how we find reviewers in critical policy studies. I think we send out reviews to 2 reviewers generally, sometimes 3, especially if we want to, if the article is not a tight fit with one of our particular groups, but we would send out the article for review to someone who has experience with the theoretical perspective or with the methodological perspective on one hand, so someone who really understands the analytical approach, and also to someone who might be a content expert, so that we can make sure that the piece actually is sensitive to context. And that's generally how we do it. It is challenging often to do that, so it doesn't always work out that that's the precise match. But we do try to do that so that the reviewers are coming from a similar orientation that we understand the article to be coming from. So they get feedback that's consistent with the point of view that they're trying to develop. Yeah, I think I will leave it at that unless there are some other specific questions about that.
Maybe if I just follow up on that. So what we usually do in the Journal of Environmental Policy and Planning is that we would try to have at least one reviewer who is an expert in the methodology and one reviewer who is an expert on the substance, the context. So we receive many case study type research pieces. And then I think it's absolutely crucially important that we have got one reviewer who really understands the context and the substance. Otherwise, it would be very shallow. We usually or regularly invite reviewers whom we expect to be sympathetic to the approach taken in the paper, because otherwise there will be too many misunderstandings and not sufficient sympathy with what the authors are trying to do. And how do we invite? I mean, I used to invite usually at least 3 or 4 reviewers, because normally I could be sure that at least 1 or 2 people would not be available. So in some cases, if I'm lucky, I receive 3 reviews, in rare cases 4 reviews, which can then of course create further complications if those 4 people have 5 different opinions on the piece. But then it's the role of the editor to sort that out a little bit, what the editor feels should be the kind of direction in which the paper would best fit with the journal. There's also an interesting question here in the chat. How do we handle the quick desk rejects? Someone said here hasty. The desk rejects shouldn't be hasty. They should be thorough. Yeah? So you want to check for each incoming manuscript whether it fits with the journal. However, I'm surprised how many manuscripts we have received where obviously the authors haven't read the mission statement of the journal. And where the work, for example, doesn't really engage in our case, in critical perspectives on environmental policy and planning. People sending in papers where they have developed an econometric model. Yeah, that's absolutely not what we want to publish. And I'm not quite sure why people submit these kind of manuscripts. So that's also an interesting experience. And then there's another question here about most published work is from Europe and the United States. So in the Journal of Environmental Policy and Planning, we have step by step tried to internationalize and globalize the approach of the journal. So the original editors were all based in the UK. That was then broadened out to editors who were then based in, let's say, Northwestern Europe. Then we've brought in editors who are based in Australia and the United States, and we've now added an editor from China who's based in Hong Kong. And that was partly also in response to the kind of manuscripts that we were receiving, because we experienced that we were increasingly receiving actually quite good manuscripts from China, which, however, we felt often not competent to fully assess, because none of us had sufficient background in the kind of Chinese environmental governance. So we thought we also need an author who has a better understanding of the context there, and also of the scholarly context in which authors might be coming. So there is a strategy here to respond to the globalizing scholarship, which also follows, I think, a more global view on the kind of problems that we are facing. Because if you look at environmental issues, many of them are closely linked to developmental issues. And that in turn had then also very interesting consequences for the journal ranking. So suddenly we were ranked, I think, the second or third highest ranking journal in developmental studies. And we had never thought about our journal as being in that area. But after reflecting on this also with our editorial board, we understood that many of the big environmental challenges are at the same time developmental challenges. Yeah? So we've worked with that feedback, which in that case came through bibliography analysis and then the ranking decisions of Reuters in that case. So there are very interesting feedback loops with which journal editors can work, and which also help to reflect on the directions in which a journal might develop.
Yeah, I'd like to speak to this question about the internationalizing also, and just to reiterate what Peter said about desk rejects. We also look very carefully as editors at the articles that come in for fit. So I think the most likely reason for a journal article to get a desk reject is because it's not a good fit for the journal. And sometimes you'll get some feedback too from the editor if it has to do with other issues around quality and things like that. But in terms of internationalizing, we're also starting to take a little bit more, put a little bit more energy into that. I don't think we have the same capacity that Jeff has to do that. But we do have an editorial board and some of the editorial team that's also reflecting some global diversity to help us with that. And so we're having a conversation about bringing in regional editors, but we're also doing a couple of other things in addition to that. And largely it has to do with who's on our board and who's engaged in our community right now. So we have one of our board members is from Brazil, and she is involved in a really interesting network that's developing critical scholarship in Brazil. And so we're working with her to strengthen our networks in Latin America and in Brazil, but also more broadly, and to do a couple of things that will sort of signal to people that we're serious about internationalizing. So we're having discussions now about what we might do. So this is all sort of aspirational, but thinking about creating a forum section in our journal, which is not full articles, but more thought pieces that might include different ideas about critical approaches to research from Latin America. So decolonization, for example, is a really important topic there that hasn't been showing up in the journal as much as it could have in the past, but that's something that's important for that region. And so we might begin to have conversations about that. And also thinking about how that changes our own perspective, in sort of the Western world too, where there are colonial things happening. Obviously in the United States, we don't think about that necessarily as post-colonial, but it certainly is, and some people do work in that area. So having some conversations about what that means, how that changes our perspective and our point of view, and then thinking about a special issue in that area, building a network of people who can review articles. I think Peter put that very nicely when he talked about the existing community might not have the capacity to provide thoughtful reviews on things that are happening in parts of the world where they don't have expertise. So building up a network of people who can provide thoughtful reviews that are coming from, have a knowledge of context is critically important to getting fair reviews for people. So I think that's a big thing. And we're also having conversations that recognize that some of the critical things that we're thinking about right now are also global patterns around the rise of authoritarianism, if you're interested in critical work, you're constantly thinking about structures of domination and oppression and making sure that we understand those things. And so we have to recognize that there are global trends that are happening there, and how can we support scholarship that addresses those kinds of issues, not just in the regions where we've had a historical connection, but expanding that into other areas.
I can just add one more thing on the fit, on the desktop reject. And I know I see a lot of hands. A good strategy for authors. One is, as Peter said, look at the mission statement of the journal, read it. Of course, look at the previous past publications, but that's not the perfect fit because some journals are adapting and changing. Internationalization is a good example of this. Picking up trends of democracy and oppression might be more of a hot topic today than it was 5 years ago or whatnot. And also look at the editorial board. But if you look at a journal, you don't see any in the editorial board that kind of has that interpretive or critical perspective. You don't see any past publications. The mission statement doesn't quite make sense. It's probably not the place for you, and I wouldn't go there. But if you do see, let's say, Jennifer Dodge in the editorial board, you see, Peter on the board, or someone that you can really identify with. Yeah, that's my type of scholarship. Odds are there might be a fit there because those editors pick that editorial board to set the direction of the journal and help with that, which means they want manuscripts like that, but the identity of that board. And it is a changing world, as Jennifer was saying. So you'll see that with policy and politics too going forward. But there's a lot of questions out there. I don't know how we're going to take all these.
No, indeed. I'm sorry, I got kicked out temporarily. I've come back and it's all kicking off, which is good. So I can see Imran's got a hand up. I can physically see, and then we've got a couple of questions in the chat. So we'll go in that order. Probably Imran first, and then we'll go to these questions that have been dropped in the chat. 2 or 3 of them now.
All right. Good day, everybody. Nice to see so many familiar faces from different interpretive and other communities. I got a question for the editors. So one of the issues you probably are dealing with a lot is also your editorial guidance when it comes to the reviews have come in, right? And then you check the reviews, how much work do you put into that? That's one of the issues I would like to ask. I have very mixed experiences with that in various journals. So sometimes even high-ranking journals give a lot of editorial guidance, particularly once you have done a first round of revision, and if they think it's promising, and of course they cannot commit. So there's a thin line there, it seems to be, for editors all the time, how much editorial guidance they will give, because it may also be seen or interpreted as a form of commitment by the journal to the article. While there's still a review process going on. So I would like to hear from you a bit, your reflections on this issue and how you deal with that as editors.
So Chris, go ahead. Yeah.
Really quick, I mean, one of them that this came up a little bit before. I mean, I do not consider the feedback, because you pick different referees for different purposes. So the feedback from referee, it should not be, I don't think, treated equally, because some people have expertise here, some people have expertise there. And for example, if I received an interpretive, let's say, based paper, and I got some comments from, let's say, a more mainstream scholar that may not fit, I would discount that feedback. And I would also give guidance to the authors to do that also. From my perspective, I really believe that a lot of our manuscripts is based on both our science and our art. And I do give as much discretion to the authors as possible to respond to those feedback from the referees in such a way that they maintain the integrity and direction of the manuscript. So at the end of the day, they can say, yeah, this is my manuscript. It's not the manuscript of the referee that told me what to do. But at the same time, there's a couple of things that are like, yeah, you got to fix this. But usually the referees or the author's like, no, yeah, that was unclear. Or yeah, I need to kind of patch that up. But usually I'm more in favor of just giving the authors free reign in terms of how to respond to that feedback in a way that they feel confident with and supportive of.
May I just say one thing? Because I hear you say also, if the review is really off, then you're kind of protecting the author, right? Is that what you're saying?
I would, if I agreed with the author's intent and believed in the manuscript, absolutely.
Yeah, so just to support what Chris is saying, there's judgment that's involved as an editor, and you often have to adjudicate different points of view that you receive from reviewers. And the majority of reviewers do an excellent job, but sometimes you'll get a review that wasn't serious or seemed to not really engage deeply, and you have to handle that situation in fairness to the author. And we do try to take a developmental approach. So we'll make sure that an author gets good feedback. And if that's not coming from the reviewer, sometimes I will offer feedback, especially if there's going to be a rejection and the reviews haven't provided constructive feedback. So it's a big responsibility to be a reviewer. You have to read every article thoughtfully and carefully and take into account the different points of view of the reviewers and make sure that they're not only providing a high quality review, but also doing it in a way that's fair to the author, and that's also consistent with the scope of the journal. So you're managing lots of different dimensions of the review process. Yeah, so I think it does involve some judgment and careful attention. Yeah. So I just want to respond. I saw Steve Connolly. Nice to see you, Steve. Put in a follow-up question there, which is, do you take a developmental approach to reviewers? And I didn't see and there's a question about doctoral students as reviewers too. So, and questions from a lot of doctoral students about how to get involved. So let me take a couple of those. That's a great question. We haven't actually taken a developmental approach with reviewers. I think it's hard to do that in the context of looking at a particular paper, because it's obviously you need to protect the integrity of the process. But so I think the tendency would be to, pass that feedback on to the author, but also put it in context and give the author some clear direction if you disagree with the review. Especially if the reviews are contradictory. If the reviews are the same, then you're in a more delicate position there in terms of taking a different perspective and point of view, or find another reviewer who's going to provide a more serious review or a more thoughtful review. So there are lots of different things that you can do there. I think we have had conversations as a broader community in terms of creating space at conferences to talk about different aspects of the review process, and I think that serves that function to give reviewers some feedback or some ideas about what the review process might look like. So it's an interesting question. And for those of you who are doctoral students who want to get involved, I would say reach out to the editors and let them know that you're interested in reviewing. Often what we do, and I think actually this does speak to Stephen's question about providing sort of context for reviewers to learn and develop too, is what we will do is we often will invite junior scholars to be a third reviewer on a piece, so that the author is getting reviews from 2 seasoned scholars at the same time that they're getting a review from a junior scholar. And I don't think I've ever given direct feedback to a junior scholar there, but they can also see the other reviews that have come in anonymously from the other reviewers. And if they're interested in developing, they might take a look at those and see where they are in relation to reviews from more seasoned scholars. But if you're interested in participating in that process, let us know that you're interested in becoming part of the community, and we can include you in reviewers. We're always looking for new reviewers and would be very interested in cultivating people who are part of the critical and interpretive community. And I will just add one more thing to that, which is how do you become part of the editorial team for journals? And so we also take a developmental approach there. So if you become an active reviewer, and have good feedback and might also submit articles yourself to the journal, we'll notice that you're very actively participating. And we might invite you to become part of the editorial board, or to become a book reviews editor, or our social media editor. We have Bill Sisk, who's here, who's doing that now. Anna Dernova has been part of the editorial team. Other people here have been as well. And once you're in the editorial team, we do try to promote from within, so that people who have been actively involved will then move on to become a forum editor or even an editor of the journal. I started as a book review editor and am now editor. We have our new editor, Laureen Elgert, was also on the book review team. So there are those opportunities for internal promotion.
Great. Oh, sorry, Peter. I don't
just very briefly.
Commenting, there are a lot of questions coming in. So after this, I'll probably take them in chunks.
Yeah. So very briefly, we've taken a similar approach that we would involve PhD students, usually as third reviewer, so that they get involved, but the acceptance of a manuscript doesn't rely on that. My experience is that these reviews have often been excellent because they are among the more diligent reviewers, or among the most diligent reviewers. And in some cases, I thought it was almost too much. So in one case, I had kind of 8 pages of a review, which was almost like a rewrite of the paper. So obviously that person had spent a week or so on the review, which, and of course, then I did a little bit of kind of mentoring with the person. And of course, I was very happy. And I think the authors were. How to get involved? Usually we find our reviewers among our authors or other authors. So because we first want to see how people write. I would be very hesitant to accept a first or second year PhD student as a reviewer. We would accept PhD students who have proven to be good authors, even if they only have 1 or 2 pieces out there. But if they are of good quality, then people have demonstrated that they are good writers. So they are then also likely to give good advice to other authors. And there are lots of interesting questions here about internationalization in the chat, but I want to leave it to the chair in which direction you want to steer the discussion.
No, indeed. So thank you very much, Peter. And that's where I was going to get to. So sorry about being ejected there for a second, but I'm back. So 2 big themes. And so I'll let you tackle them however you want to on the panel. But I guess the two things coming through. So one is a question from Emily earlier about writing a covering letter. And I guess it speaks to the question about a relationship with the editor as an author and the extent to, how much effort should you put into that? What should we expect in terms of, being shepherded through the process? And what are you open to? What would you recommend? And then the other one is this very interesting question about internationalization. And so I think Anna Donova's written a really interesting point here, which has got a lot of support in the comments. Sometimes if you're talking about places that are not familiar, basically the reviewers want so much background contextual information about that place that you don't get to say the interesting things you want. There's sort of balance. How do you balance the need to present the context? So, and this also speaks to, there was also a follow-up question, I think specifically for you, Peter, about Africa and development and environment. So I'll let you handle them in whatever way you see fit, and look, I'll keep monitoring the chat for more questions.
I can dive into some of these, but not everything. First, real quick on the PhD student, I see a lot of senior scholars on this that I know. One thing you can do for us editors is that when we ask you to do a manuscript, promote your PhD students, especially in their 4th, 5th, 6th year, the senior ones, and the junior scholars, because that brings us their attention to us, and also relieves your work. And so I think the best advocates for PhD students are actually their advisors. In terms of the cover letter, at least my experience, I don't put sometimes I look at them seriously, but usually if I can't pick up the manuscript and read the abstract, read the opening section, make sense of it, and the manuscript itself, if I can't do that, usually the cover letter doesn't help out too much. Usually I could pick up a manuscript and I should just be able to make sense of it. So I think for my cover letters, when I send it to an editor, I just say, hey, thank you for your attention and your consideration, and I do appreciate it. And that's all I ever say. There's a few exceptions to that, but not much.
So let me speak to Anna's question about internationalization. I think it's a really important question, and we need to be reflective about that as editors and as a broader community. I think obviously when, we have a heritage and a tradition, as Peter nicely described, where we have people who are coming from certain geographical regions and are involved in a long-term conversation around critical interpretive work, in North America and Europe primarily. And as we try to open up and branch out, people who are being invited into the journal are entering an ongoing conversation already. So there is a reality there. And often there is a need to provide some background information for an audience in order to understand your piece. But I think as we do that, and as we open up our doors to invite people who have different perspectives, and we also have to think about how we can change how we do things so that we're more inviting. And we're trying to do that in a thoughtful way as we expand in Latin America, for example. And we're also doing some expansion in other parts. I know someone asked a question about scholars who are coming from Africa, and do we have plans to broaden there? And we have done a symposium on implementation issues in 3 different countries in Africa, looking at a range of policy issues. So there is some intention there, but we don't have strong relationships there. So if you're interested in doing that, please come talk to us and reach out to us. But I think what needs to happen, there needs to be a 2-way conversation about how are we creating a space that's inviting and nurturing for people who are coming from different parts of the world? How can we do that in a thoughtful way that also changes, how we are? There's a couple of examples around this. We're working on, trying to create space for a symposium on Indigenous knowledge. It ended up following through, but the authors and people who were trying to organize that piece were asking us to rethink how we see the knowledge production process, and to question, who our reviewers are, because from an Indigenous point of view, it's not always the most productive feedback to get feedback from a scholarly point of view. There also needs to be a community perspective there. So we were willing to have that conversation. I think it's very much in alignment with, critical policy studies to think seriously about those questions. And we did have some conversations about who are appropriate reviewers for that type of work. I think we're having a similar conversation right now as we try to expand into Latin America. Our colleague on the editorial board, Rosanna, is asking us to think about knowledge production processes and sort of this, I know the term Global South is a very loaded term, but I'll use it because I think people will understand what we're talking about. There's a hierarchy in knowledge production processes, and we have to rethink that to be welcoming and open to scholarship that's coming from Latin America that might, do scholarship in a different way. So how are we approaching that and thinking about that? So I think the short answer is we have to be reflective about and reflexive about how we're creating that kind of space and being open to challenging our own practices around that, so that it's not just staying in the same conversation that we've been having, but opening ourselves a little bit more.
Yeah, just to follow up, I think this has been very thoughtful. I think people also have to understand that journal editing is an unpaid hobby. So you do that on a Saturday afternoon. We do that on top of all the other duties, which also limits how much we can do in terms of kind of developing new spaces. So I think what is very important, if you want to get involved, if you think there are important topics, is that you get in touch with the journals, usually through submitting manuscripts. When I try to describe a little bit this kind of more international global outlook that JEP now has compared to 10 years ago, that was not least in response to a changing composition of manuscripts that we have received. And that was not just from China, although that was kind of the strongest stream here. We also have received a rising number of manuscripts from Africa, a little bit less from Latin America, but the strong community obviously is there in Mexico. So what we suddenly noticed is that there appear to be new communities, new scholarly communities who engage with this kind of research and develop new horizons, both geographically, but also kind of new scholarly perspectives, because current themes from the journal were taken up and then often interpreted in quite surprising ways. So methods were applied in kind of novel and interesting ways. So in that sense, we have also now published a number of papers from scholars who are based in Africa. So not just European or American scholars who do fieldwork in Africa, but really scholars who are based in, well, particularly Nigeria and South America were very strong. South Africa were very strong. And of course, there's still an imbalance here. And of course, you recognize there are certain countries that in Africa that have comparatively well-funded university and academic systems. But these scholars approach the journals. And then in our case, the editors became interested and said, oh, here's something going on. So let's see whether we can, for example, develop an agenda around this. And then you can also, as a journal editor, we are always interested in proposals for special issues. And increasingly for these special issues proposals, we're also looking for a good geographical spread, or that the guest editors have a more global outlook. Yeah, so I think we would find it very difficult to now accept a special issue that would have a very narrow kind of Northwestern European, North American outlook. We would like to see how certain approaches, how certain ideas can be applied to understand environmental policy and planning in very different locations and in very different contexts, because that's the kind of world we are living in. Yeah? So therefore, there are lots of feedback processes going on here. And if you feel that they're interesting agendas, try to look for journals that might be interested, get in touch with the editors, either through manuscripts or through special issue proposals. And that's increasingly what we are also experiencing. So the development of the journal is partly also driven by the engagement of small groups or networks of people who come together and say, well, we've got something to say, we need a good vehicle for this. And that journal might be a good platform to reach out to other scholars and communities. And just a final remark, there are some interesting questions here about why do we need a word limit in terms of digital publishing? Well, JEP still has a printed copy, and even if we had not, I think I would still like to keep to word limits because that also forces authors to articulate their ideas in a concise way. Usually the 8,000 word manuscripts are much sharper than the 12,000 words manuscripts, which we also receive. And when we then guide authors, usually the shorter piece is stronger than the larger piece. And now we always have the opportunities to have additional online material where you can further elaborate or provide more evidence, etc. But to have that relatively short and sharp 7,000 or 8,000 word piece, I think still is a value because it encourages authors to focus on the main contribution that they have to offer. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
So I think I've seen there's in the chat, we've got some very useful suggestions for crafting papers. So there's a very nice suggestion there with a link for people who are interested. So thank you for that. We've only got 5 minutes to go, and I have promised our guest speakers that we give them, the afternoon off or the morning off, wherever that. So we'll stick to that. So yeah, there was this question, a couple of people pitched in about, I think specifically in relation to internationalization and people from other parts of the world where we might be less familiar, flexibility and word limits for that. Peter's already given his answer, but I'd be interested in from Jennifer and Chris as well. The other part, this was a question that came in before the talk and is pretty topical. I don't know, on my Twitter feed, there's been a lot of talk about Nature and their $9,000 charge for publishing. And open access obviously is often a big issue, but it's about, I guess, the impact once you publish of getting the message out there. And I'm wondering what journal editors think of this, what ideas they have for, spreading the word. Getting published research out there into the community, into the people who are interested in using it. So that's a question. And it was raised, again, an interesting thing in our Twitter feed. Somebody popped in about the relevance of the work we do, right? Are we training to do it, or is mainstream political science in particular being trained to be irrelevant, and are we just publishing for a kind of echo chamber? Is there stuff we can do to get the message out there? Which I think is an interesting, important one. So I thought that would be a good one to finish on.
There's a lot of questions there, John. I mean, I guess policy and politics, we're big into tweeting. We have various aspects of the publishing model, which I can get to. Doesn't allow everything to be open access, but we try to make everything as open access as we can. And some countries have agreements with the journal that enables that. But if I had my choice, everything would be. And also, actually, I think it's kind of clever. We also invite authors and encourage them to essentially create blogs of their articles, and we support them doing that. And that's also published. And so not only is there like an 8,000 or 10,000 piece of scholarship, there's also an 800-word kind of summary of it that may kind of boil down the main message for a wider audience. But the publishing model is changing across the world, and that's a broader discussion in terms of making everything open access, which would be best way to go. I don't know if I answered everything that you said, John, but I'll leave it.
No, that's, I mean, I asked too much, but that's a nice way to wrap up. So that's great. Thanks, Chris.
I think we can take it under advisement to expand the word limit. Authors do request that, and we have granted extensions in the past. I think Hank is raising a really important question, though, because there are things that you can do in a long format that you can't do in a short format. So if you're doing really in-depth ethnographic work, and the arguments that you want to make are best presented by sharing rich, detailed ethnographic notes or interview quotes. And it's much harder to do that in an 8,000-word article and do justice to that. Unfortunately, the journal, CPS is also still in a paper format, so we have a strict word limit overall. So we do have those kinds of constraints. Not everything is just an online format. But I think that question and the open access question are things that we really need to take seriously and have ongoing conversations about that. But we can, we can grant exceptions to the, 9,000 or 8,000 word limit that we have under those kinds of circumstances, where it would really do harm to the argument to cut out a bunch of quotes and rich ethnographic details. And we've done that recently. So that is definitely a possibility. I want to end on this question of relevance. I think we really strongly support work that has something to say about things that are going on in the world. And we prioritize, relevance over so-called rigor, although of course we want to see high quality, strong pieces in the journal. But the main criterion that we use to accept pieces is that they take a critical perspective on important things that are going on in the world. And so we want to see articles that are of critical relevance to the things that are going on in the world that deserve a critical lens. So I'll end it there for the sake of time. But I think I'm going to save the chat. I don't know, John and Marta, if you have an intention of saving the chat. I encourage those of you who didn't get your questions answered to reach out to me directly. I'd be happy to speak to you more. And if there's a need for it, we can consider maybe doing another panel like this, because it seems like there was a lot of interest there. So if you're interested in that, maybe make a comment in the chat box, especially for those of you who are junior scholars, doctoral students, if there are things that we can do to, people coming from other places who might be unfamiliar with the way we do things, let us know and we can try to create some space to further the conversation.
Great, thank you very much, Jennifer. And Peter, I'll let you have the final word before we wrap up.
Yeah, I'm currently involved here in a chat discussion about the length of manuscripts. I think there is an important point here because there is a certain normativity in certain lengths, and that favors more statistical work or where interpretive and ethnographic work needs more space. But that's where the additional online material becomes really important. So I think as interpretive scholars within that journal environment and with journals that have to work with page limits and page budgets, and they are actually the publishers are really in our neck. So that really is a very strict budget. So if we allow more space for some manuscripts, that means we can accept fewer pieces altogether. Yeah, so that's also a very difficult trade-off that we have to make. So therefore, if you want to publish work that, for example, needs some ample presentation of quotes of ethnographic findings, etc., think about the publication as a multi-level publication so that you've got the core statement in your whatever it is, 8,000 words or whatever, and then makes good links to the additional online material. And as far as I've seen numbers, that online material is also downloaded or visited by readers. So that's not lost in the background. But readers who are really interested in material will go to that additional material. And that's where the new digital publishing world or the hybrid publishing world really has lots of advantages. Yeah? I also know many people increasingly use their own websites to which they point where readers can then find additional material just to kind of support the argument that you're making with your interpretations that necessarily with those word limits needs to be more concise and shorter. Yeah? So in that sense, I would think about the kind of 8,000 word piece as the very concise statement that is the main contribution also to conceptual discussions for the community, which is then backed up by more empirical material, which personally I really love because I love all these original quotes that really bring a world to life for the reader. Yeah, otherwise, thanks a lot for organizing this. I've also learned a lot, and I think we could discuss this for another couple of hours.
Right, it's unfortunate. Yes. We need to let people get off and do their things and cook dinner and have meetings and so on. So, but thank you so much, all of you, for your time, and thanks so much for the really impressive turnout and the great comments in the chat and so on. So we are more than open to further discussion on this and to thinking about doing further events. This particularly via the Critical Policy Studies group for APSA, also via the ECPR group on theoretical perspectives on public policy. So please get in touch with those groups, get in touch with us if you have any further questions, and we might try and arrange a kind of a follow-up at some point to bring the conversation further. Otherwise, I'll let everyone get on with their day. Thank you very much.